generations, the young American nation looks ever westward. President Thomas Jefferson, calling it an empire for liberty, makes the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. When he sends Lewis and Clark up the Missouri River in 1804, he initiates the opening of the Trans-Mississippi West and the creation of a continental nation. Out of this chaotic and bloody rush westward, a new people will be born. In the century of struggle to follow, many names will become the stuff of legend, but two will shine above all the rest, symbolizing the story of the Great West: Kit Carson and Buffalo Bill Cody.
As the United States spreads across the continent, a lot of Eastern images of the West began to get picked up by the popular press. Novels are written about Western heroes, about men of the frontier, about buckskin-clad heroes on the order of Cooper's Leatherstocking. The first is Daniel Boone. The next great Western hero is Davy Crockett. And Kit Carson, whether he likes it or not, whether he expects it or not, becomes the next embodiment of this frontier hero.
Unlike Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill is a hero of the New West. The west of the regular army, of Custer and the 7th Cavalry. The west of the railroads steaming across the prairie. The west of the cattle drives, the mining booms, gold and silver. The west of the Indians' last stand. He lives it. And then he takes it on the road. He makes it into a show. The Wild West, America's greatest myth.
It is the autumn of 1849, and in a tale as old as the frontier itself, a party of dragoons from Taos, New Mexico, raced to rescue a white woman and her child, captured by Apache raiders on the Santa Fe Trail. In the vanguard rides Kit Carson, America's famed frontiersman, widely celebrated as a hunter, mountain man, Army scout, and hero of countless Indian fights. It is a day that will be seared forever into Kit Carson's mind, a day in which he confronts his legend head-on, a day he will never forget.
We finally came in view of the Indian camp. March! The commanding officer ordered the men to charge, but the order was too late for the desired effect. In about 200 yards, pursuing the Indians, the body of Mrs. White was found, perfectly warm, had not been killed more than 5 minutes, shot through the heart with an arrow. She evidently knew that someone was coming to her rescue. It was apparent that she was endeavoring to make her escape when she received the fatal shot.
And in her hands was a novel fresh off the press, the first novel written about Kit Carson as an American hero. And he looked down and saw this woman that he couldn't save and this completely made-up story about him. And one can only imagine the feeling he would have had about the hollowness of the promise of American heroism and the life that he couldn't save.
In camp was found a book, the first of the kind I'd ever seen, in which I was made a great hero, slaying Indians by the hundred. And I've often thought that as Mrs. White would read the same, and knowing that I lived near, she would pray for my appearance and that she would be saved. I did come, but had not the power.
Ever since Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, American heroes have had to measure up to a certain kind of a profile. They have to be unfailingly brave. They have to be unfailingly manly. They always have to rescue the damsel in distress.
The incident with Mrs. White is one of the most remarkable in all of Western history, and certainly for Carson, one of the turning points in his life. He meets this legend, which he hadn't quite understood, head on, and he's very uncomfortable with this position he's been placed in. Later, when the book was read to him, he said, "Throw it in the fire, burn it. He hated the idea of what they had made him into, but he hated even more failing, that he couldn't live up to the Eastern expectation of what the great hunter hero of the West was supposed to be.
The Carson family follows the pioneer trail blazed by Daniel Boone. Lindsay Carson, eldest son of a Scots-Irish immigrant, is born in North Carolina in 1754. After fighting in the American Revolution, he moves his growing family to Madison County, Kentucky in 1792. It is there on Christmas Eve 1809, his second wife, Rebecca, gives birth to a son they name Christopher. The boy is called Kit from his earliest days. The 11th of Lindsay Carson's 15 children, he grows up surrounded by a boisterous, adventurous brood. The family moves west in 1811, settling at Boone's Lick in Howard County, Missouri. 7 years later, when Kit is but 8, tragedy strikes. While felling trees to clear his farm, his father is killed. Kit becomes increasingly difficult to handle after his father's death. Rebecca, remarrying in 1821, soon apprentices the boy to a saddler in Old Franklin, Missouri.
I was apprenticed to David Workman to learn the saddler trade. I remained with him but 2 years. He was a good man, but the labor was distasteful to me. And being anxious to travel for the purpose of seeing different countries, I concluded to join the first party for the Rocky Mountains.
So the boy lights out for the frontier to escape a shopkeeper's life and the soft comforts of civilization. He can little imagine that he will actually bring to the West all he hopes to escape from. When he joins a Santa Fe-bound caravan in August 1826, it leads to the first appearance of his name in a newspaper.
Notice is hereby given to all persons that Christopher Carson, a boy about 16 years old, small of his age but thick-set, light hair, ran away from the subscriber living in Franklin, Howard County, Missouri, to whom he had been bound to learn the saddler's trade on or about the 1st of September last.
Oh, Shenandoah, I long to see you. Away, you rolling river. Oh, Shenandoah, I long to see you. Away.
The Santa Fe Trail was basically a highway of commerce stretching from central Missouri, which in 1821, when the trail opened, was the edge of the American frontier. And it led southwestward across the high plains to the Mexican province of New Mexico and the markets of Santa Fe and other cities on south down into northern Mexico.
It was a route along which people of different kinds met, for better or for worse, sometimes violently, sometimes meeting together in good fellowship, sometimes trading with each other, sometimes robbing each other. But it was just an incredibly vibrant part of the American West at a time when the United States wasn't in control yet.
And then what's there at the end of the trail may sound romantic, but you ride into Santa Fe, and it's a dusty, small, little adobe town, nothing like that you see in St. Louis, Missouri, or any of the towns back east. And it's a strange culture, different people. It's anything but a great throne seat of the Spanish Empire or the Mexican Empire. It's a surprisingly squatty little small, nothing of a town. And this is your destination.
Carson spends the winter in Taos, then the center of the southwestern fur trade, before hiring on as a teamster on the road south to El Paso and the Mexican copper mines on the Gila River. Returning to Taos in August 1828, he falls in with the famed trapper Ewing Young.
Ewing Young raised a party of 40 men, consisting of Americans, Canadians, and Frenchmen. We left Taos in August 1829. We traveled through the country occupied by the Navajo Indians, past the village of Zuni, and on to the head of the Salt River, one of the tributaries of the Rio Gila.
They headed out from New Mexico, crossed Arizona, and trapped the valleys of central California. And after that trip, 1829 to 31, Kit was no longer an apprentice. He was a full-fledged mountain man in his own right.
Carson comes of age in his time with Ewing Young, but his small, wiry frame never quite measures up to the oversized image Easterners hold of mountain men and hunter heroes.
You know, Kit Carson doesn't look like much. He's only 5'5". To be a scout, well, it just doesn't seem possible. He's a runt. And yet, there are these clear blue eyes. And when you look into them, they say, "Don't mess with me."
In the autumn of 1831, young Carson joins a band of trappers headed by Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick. Heading north with them to winter on Idaho's Salmon River, they trap throughout the Rockies.
Kit Carson was involved in the last glory days of the heyday of the fur trade, and he knew people like Jim Bridger. They were closely associated. Jim Beckworth, the famous Black Mountain man, Joe Meek. Joe Meek and Kit Carson had many hellacious adventures together, and these men were like a band of brothers, as they say in those days.
Colorado is a beautiful land. It appears to be a paradise at a distance, but it's also a barrier. It also can completely swallow you up. Deep gorges, mountains where thunderstorms can develop and flash floods can sweep you away in the middle of the night, where wildlife in great abundance is sometimes very hostile. And then you've also got the hostile inhabitants. Add all that up, you're actually riding into a nightmare.
It is hard, dangerous work, with both nature and man constantly threatening the trappers. Carson has numerous confrontations with the tribes in the northern Rockies, Blackfoot, Crow, and Sioux, as well as with the southern tribes, Ute, Navajo, Cheyenne, Apache, and Comanche. One of the most dramatic incidents occurs in 1833. While returning to New Mexico, Carson, Joe Meek, and 4 other trappers are surprised by 200 Comanche on the Cimarron.
Joe Meek called it the Mule Fort Fight, one of the epic battles of all of Western history. Carson and his men tried to outrun the Comanches, but their mules were no match for the fleet Comanche Mustangs. Carson orders a halt. Much to the surprise and chagrin of his companions, dismounting, he slits the throat of his mule. They follow suit. They ford up behind the dead animals. The Indians charge, but their Mustangs balk once they smell the blood of the mules, and so they can't get close. All day long, the battle rages at long distance. 40 Comanches fall before it's over. Finally, the trappers sneak off under cover of darkness, hot-footing it out of Comanche territory, lucky to get away with their hair.
Despite the unrelenting danger, or perhaps because of it, Carson loves the trapper's life. In later years, he will always remember his youthful days in the mountains as the happiest time of his life.
The point of the Rocky Mountain fur trade, of course, was the harvesting of beaver. Beaver furs brought a good price, $6 a pound, and the mountain men would trap during the long season, which was the cool weather. Summer was the off season. They would come out of the mountains bringing their beaver fur, their bales or bundles of fur, and attend the annual rendezvous, which were held at various places in the central or northern Rockies.
Carson comes to the Green River Rendezvous in search of trade goods and a good time. Instead, he finds danger, a bride, and the beginnings of a legend. Kit Carson attends the 1835 Green River Rendezvous in western Wyoming. It is a wild gathering full of gambling, drinking, and sharp business dealing.
This is a party like you have never seen in your life. This is a time when all kinds of deals are made and broken. It's a time when the trappers have all kinds of money to spend, and they spend it wildly. Guns going off all the time, fights going off all the time, people going off into teepees all the time to transact all the business that they might transact in those places. Men and women getting together for life or just for the night. They are absolutely whopping great, extravagant parties.
But Kit has more on his mind than trading his furs and carousing with his trapper companions.
If you were going to be a successful fur trapper, the best thing you could do would be to be a successful family man. And of course, the person that you relied on as your partner in work, as your entree to the entire world of the West, as the person who would show you where to go to get your pelts, help you set the traps, help you bring them out, was an Indian woman.
When Kit Carson trappers mountain men marrying Indian women, from a white perspective, I would think it's really kind of them entering and becoming Indian and becoming savage-like, and they left civilization. And they would be blamed and perhaps not forgiven. But it was a new West.
So Kit, having been Indianized himself, and he was still a fairly young man, about 25 years old, he arrived at the rendezvous and spotted a young Arapaho girl named Wanibe, which in the Arapaho language meant grass singing. He soon found that there was a rival for her attentions, an overbearing and arrogant French trapper, a huge Goliath of a man, well over 6 feet, and had a mean temper, picking fights with everybody in camp. Most of the trappers, as hardy as they were steering clear of Joseph Chouinard.
A missionary on his way to Oregon to convert the Indians is horrified by the white savages he finds at the rendezvous. His account of his Western travels and of the French trapper's challenge will be the first mention of Kit Carson in a book when published in New York in 1838.
Kit Carson, an American, told him if he wished to die, he would accept the challenge. Chouinard defied him. Carson mounted his horse and with a loaded pistol rushed into close contact, and both, almost at the same instant, fired. Carson's ball entered Chouinard's hand, came out at the wrist, and passed through the arm above the elbow.
Carson, having disgraced the Frenchman, comes to claim his prize.
After the duel, Kit went to the teepee of Wanibe's father to dicker over the bride price, which was customary among all the Plains Indians. And Kit, in the end, had to pay a very steep price. 1 new trade rifle, 3 mules, and 7 Hudson Bay wool trade blankets.
Carson takes his bride north with Jim Bridger's party of trappers to work the 3 forks of the Missouri country of western Montana. This is Blackfoot country, and the trappers must continually fight their rivals for the right to be in this rich hunting ground.
While he's with Jim Bridger, Carson's in numerous fights with the Blackfeet. It's almost a daily occurrence, it seems. In fact, he treats it later on as if it was like the changing weather, very matter-of-factly.
Wanibe soon bears Kit a daughter, who they name Adeline. Faced with unrelenting danger from the Blackfeet, Kit leaves Bridger's company and takes his wife and daughter south to Brown's Hole in northwestern Colorado, where he hires on as a contract hunter at Fort Davy Crockett. For 2 years, he tends his little family and keeps the 20 inhabitants of the outpost in venison. Then tragedy strikes. Wanibe gives birth to another daughter in 1839, but dies soon after from the childbirth complications so common on the frontier. Carson's world is overturned, and his days in the mountains over.
Kit lost his beloved Wanibe, and he never quite got over it, never forgot her. Later, he took his 2 little daughters, and about 1841 left the mountains. The fur trade was collapsing. The price of beaver had plummeted, and so Kit left with his daughters and went down out of the mountains to Bent's Fort in southeastern Colorado, and got a job there at that trading post as a hunter.
Charles and William Bent had built their fort on the north bank of the Arkansas River in 1833. Along with their partner, Siran St. Vrain, they quickly captured the rich buffalo hide trade with the Cheyennes and the Arapahoes. Soon the fort became an important way station on the Santa Fe Trail as well.
This is a place where Arapaho and Cheyenne Indians come in to trade. It's a place the American Army will pass through on its way to conquer northern Mexico. It's a place where Mexican traders come, and it's a place where everybody gets together to do their business and to meet and greet with each other.
I was kindly received at the fort by Messieurs Bent and St. Vrain, offered employment to hunt for the fort at $1 per day, accepted this offer, and remained in their employ till 1842. I wish I was capable to do Bent and St. Vrain justice for the kindness received at their hands. I can only say that their equals were never in the mountains.
Tragedy befalls Carson yet again. His youngest child, but a toddler, accidentally falls into a vat of boiling water and dies. Taking Adeline, he joins one of Bent's wagon trains heading eastward in April 1842.
It had been a long time since I'd been among civilized people. I arrived at the States, went and saw my friends and acquaintances, and took a trip to St. Louis.
Carson leaves Adeline with his sister in St. Louis so that she may be educated there in a Catholic school. Then he takes a steamboat back up the Missouri River. On the journey, he meets Lieutenant John Charles Fremont. The young officer is in search of a guide.
On the boat, I met Kit Carson. He was returning from putting his little daughter in a convent school at St. Louis. I was pleased with him and his manner of address at this first meeting. He was a man of medium height, broad-shouldered and deep-chested, with a clear, steady blue eye and frank speech and address. Quiet and unassuming.
I informed him that I'd been some time in the mountains and thought I could guide him to any point he wished to go. He replied that he would make inquiries regarding my capabilities of performing that which I promised. He done so and told me I'd be employed. His object was to survey the South Pass and to take the height of the highest peaks of the Rocky Mountains.
They were very different personalities and certainly men of very distinct character. Fremont was one of those who had a tendency toward self-promotion, a tendency toward publicity and showmanship, and that was not part of Kit's makeup at all.
Fremont will have a profound impact on Carson's life, making him the most famous frontiersman in America. In turn, Carson will contribute significantly to the success of Fremont's 3 Western expeditions. It is the beginning of a grand collaboration and deep friendship that will change forever the lives of both men and dramatically alter the destiny of the American West.
You're watching Carson and Cody, the Hunter Heroes, on the History Channel.
By September 1842, Kit Carson and John C. Fremont have completed the survey of South Pass and part company at Fort Laramie. Carson heads south down the Front Range to Taos, while Fremont returns east to write a report of the expedition.
Many of those who know John Charles Fremont think the smartest thing that he ever does is to marry Jessie Benton, daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, senator from Missouri, incredibly powerful American senator. Jessie is a woman to match Fremont's own temperament. She's impetuous, she's brilliant, she's ambitious.
Fremont wrote his official reports of his expedition something in the nature of a narrative. Actually, his wife, Jessie, who was probably better educated than he was, spruced up those reports, and I think she became almost enamored of Kit because in her husband's diaries, he'd painted him in such extravagant terms. He had truly lionized Kit Carson as this wonderful frontier figure, this paragon of all Western virtue.
Jessie's father, the powerful Missouri Senator Thomas Hart Benton, has 10,000 copies of the report printed at government expense. They are quickly sold. The book will make Fremont and his intrepid guide Kit Carson into national heroes. All of this is far from Carson's mind, as he returns to Taos in hopes of settling down.
In late 1842, Kit Carson met the beautiful Josefa Jaramillo. She came from a prominent family. Her ancestors went well back into the colonial period in New Mexico. Her father was fairly prominent, not wealthy, but Josefa was considered a rare beauty.
They marry on February 6, 1843 in Taos. Josefa is only 15, not an uncommon age for a frontier bride, while the groom is 33. She impresses all who meet her with her grace, refinement, and beauty.
This is a marriage that makes it possible for Kit Carson to live in the West as a person who's connected to the most important people there. He has a very large group of friends and relatives who live around him throughout New Mexico and southern Colorado. They're united by kinship, they're united by friendship, and this is how Kit Carson becomes kind of a native in the American West, by marrying into the Jaramillo clan. And it is also a marriage which evidently was very successful on an emotional level too. He loved her with all of his heart.
The newlyweds make their home in Taos, but Kit does not remain there for long. In July 1843, he joins Fremont for a second expedition. This one far more ambitious than the first.
Fremont came to be called the Pathfinder, but he was really more of a path maker. He was a booster, he was a promoter, he was a romantic adventurer. He's not a conventional explorer like Lewis and Clark. He had a contagious enthusiasm for the West, and the whole nation caught the bug. It was later written that upon the ashes of his campfires, the great cities of the American West rose.
Fremont's orders are to lead an exploration of the trail from the Missouri frontier to the Pacific coast at the mouth of the Columbia. Before their return to St. Louis over a year later, Carson and Fremont will circuit almost the entire West, exploring the Great Salt Lake and giving a name to the Great Basin, penetrating Oregon, and crossing the mighty Sierra Nevada in midwinter to Sutter's Fort on the Sacramento River, traversing California from north to south, then following the Old Spanish Trail. Finally, they crossed the Rockies to return to Bent's Fort, reaching it on July 2, 1844. Bent holds a grand July 4th dinner in their honor before Carson heads home to Josefa. He again determines to settle down.
I arrived in Taos and remained till March 1845. Then Dick Owens and I concluded that as we had rambled enough, that it would be advisable for us to go and settle on some good stream and make us a farm. We went to Little Cimarron, about 45 miles east of Taos, built ourselves little huts, put in considerable grain, and commenced getting out timber to enlarge our improvements.
Back in Washington, Fremont labors over his report. He once again retreats before the imposing blank page and calls on Jesse for reinforcements. The second report, with Fremont and Carson the romantic heroes, is even more successful than the first. Once again, Congress authorizes a printing of 10,000 copies, and once again, they are eagerly snapped up by a public fascinated with the West. Carson's exploits lead many to follow westward in his footsteps.
They become very accessible guidebooks for people who want to travel west. Ordinary Americans who are going on the Oregon Trail. Brigham Young read Fremont's reports, and that's really the way that people knew where to go and what to do when they got out into the West. They followed Fremont's guide.
Carson's attempt to settle down proves premature, for in August 1845 comes word from Fremont that he is needed for a third expedition.
The year previous, I'd given my word to Fremont that in case he should return for the purpose of making any more exploration, that I would willingly join him. He reached Bent's Fort about 1st of August and sent an express to me. Then Owens and I sold out for about half of what it was worth, and we started to join Fremont.
Fremont's official orders call for him to explore the Great Basin and find passages over the Sierras into the Mexican state of California. But that's not what really is going on. War clouds are already gathering on the Rio Grande. War with Mexico is imminent. Fremont, Kit Carson, and their men are now to be agents of empire, agents of conquest, and California is the prize.
On January 15, 1846, Kit Carson and John C. Fremont lead their men into the relative sanctuary of Sutter's Fort on the Sacramento.
In 1846, while he was in Northern California, trouble ensued, and it began to appear that the war had broken out. They did not have confirmation of that in the beginning, but Fremont and his men, on orders of the Mexican governor in California, left and went north up into Oregon, and a messenger there, Lieutenant Gillespie, arrived bringing dispatches from Washington and confirmation that war had broken out between the United States and Mexico.
Fremont promptly heads south with his 60 heavily armed men and joins the Bear Flag Revolt. The Americans quickly seize all of Northern California.
Fremont sends Kit Carson on a courier mission across country to carry military dispatches to the War Department in Washington. And Kit sets out and gets across the deserts of Arizona and arrives on the Rio Grande in central New Mexico, where he runs into General Stephen Watts Kearny, who just a few months before has marched over the Santa Fe Trail and seized New Mexico for the United States.
Carson informs Kearny that Fremont and Commodore Robert Stockton have already conquered California. Kearny, ordering Carson to guide him west, sends 2/3 of his troops back to New Mexico while leading 100 dragoons and 2 howitzers towards San Diego. He receives the startling news that the Californios have risen in revolt against the Americans, and that Andres Pico, with 100 lancers, is between him and San Diego at San Pascual. The general decides to attack the enemy camp. It is a serious mistake that almost costs Carson his life.
When we were within 100 yards of their camp, my horse fell and threw me, and my rifle was broken into 2 pieces. I came very near to being trodden to death. I being in advance, the whole command had to pass over me. I finally saved myself by crawling from under them. I then ran on about 100 yards to where the fight had commenced. A dragoon had been killed. I took his gun and cartridge box and joined in the melee.
Stockton hurries reinforcements to rescue Kearny's column, which finally limps into San Diego on December 12th. The following month, the combined forces of Stockton and Kearny defeat Andres Pico at the Battle of Los Angeles. On January 13th, Fremont meets with Pico and signs a treaty ending the California conflict. But Kearny, furious that the flamboyant Fremont has stolen his glory in the treaty signing, refuses to recognize Stockton's appointment of the young officer as civil governor of California.
Almost immediately after California is officially conquered, Fremont gets into a squabble with General Kearny over who's really in command. Gets caught in the middle, in fact, between an Army-Navy inter-service fight over authority. What he finally gets out of all that is a court-martial.
Fremont entrusts his version of the California conquest to Kit Carson, who again departs for Washington on February 25, 1847, arriving near the end of May. In company with Jesse Benton Fremont, he meets President James K. Polk. Carson, in his simple manner, explains Fremont's side of the California dispute to the president. Polk, who destroyed Davy Crockett's political career a decade earlier, assures Kit of his support for Fremont while already planning his court-martial. Carson quickly sees through the powerful men of Washington, confiding to Jesse Fremont.
They are princes here in their big houses, but on the plains, we are the princes. What would their lives be without us there?
In mid-June, Carson is ordered back to California with dispatches. By the time he reaches Los Angeles in October, both Kearny and Fremont have departed for Washington, and the court-martial that will lead Fremont to resign from the Army. The new military officers in California are all anxious to meet the famous Kit Carson, and none more so than a young lieutenant of artillery, William Tecumseh Sherman.
His fame was then at a height from the publication of Fremont's books, and I was very anxious to see a man who had achieved such feats of daring among the wild animals of the Rocky Mountains and still wilder Indians of the plains. I cannot express my surprise at beholding a small, stoop-shouldered man with reddish hair, freckled face, soft blue eyes, and nothing to indicate extraordinary courage or daring.
On May 4th, 1848, Carson again heads east carrying government dispatches of the highest importance. In his saddlebags is the first news of the discovery of gold at a mill near Sutter's Fort. News that will change Kit Carson's West forever.
You're watching Carson and Cody, the Hunter Heroes, on the History Channel.
Carson, finally returning to Taos in October 1848, is all the more anxious to settle down and tend to his family. He declines to join Fremont in 1849 for a privately funded expedition to cross the Rockies in midwinter, which ends in disaster, with 10 of Fremont's men dying of cold and hunger in Colorado's San Juan Mountains. Fremont is nursed back to health by Kit and Josefa before heading to California via the southern route. He is soon elected the first senator from the new state of California. In 1856, he will be selected as the first presidential candidate of the new Republican Party. But his heroic credentials cannot overcome his strong anti-slavery opinions, and he is defeated. Carson's admiration for him never wavers.
I can never forget his treatment of me while in his employ, and how cheerfully he suffered with his men when undergoing the severest of hardships. His perseverance and willingness to participate in all that was undertaken, no matter whether the duty was rough or easy, is the main cause of his success.
In 1853, Carson assumes a new role when appointed Indian agent for the Ute tribe. Despite his inability to read or write English, he is fluent in Spanish, has a working command of several Indian dialects, and ably carries out the very duties of his new position.
Carson was a highly successful Indian agent, far more so than those who would follow him as Indian agents in the West. He understood the Indians, he had befriended many of them, and he treated them absolutely as individuals, not as a racial group. When he spoke of Apaches, he never would speak of Apaches, he would speak of Mescaleros or Jicarillas. It was always the tribe, and if not the tribe, sometimes even the band.
Obviously, he knew them as people because of trade relations, and they were friends. And so in the process of him becoming an agent, he becomes almost like a mediator, a cultural mediator. He's a very fair person, a person who's principled, a person who's illiterate, but a person that legend says that his word is good as gold, a person to be believed.
With the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, all hope of settling down vanishes. Carson resigns his position as Indian agent and immediately joins the 1st New Mexico Volunteers. Promoted to colonel, he takes an active part in General Edward Canby's bungled campaign against invading Confederates. At the vital fort at Valverde, the Yankees make their stand.
It was a hot fight, and Carson's Hispanic volunteers stood up to the fire from the Texans. In fact, they held their line, but the Union troops elsewhere began to retreat, and soon the Texans carried the day. Later, the regulars under Canby would blame Carson and blame the volunteers for the failure, but the failure was really on the part of Canby and the regulars.
The Confederates advance onto Albuquerque and Santa Fe before being defeated by Union troops at Glorieta Pass, just to the east of Santa Fe. Carson is out of the action and assigned to command Fort Craig in southern New Mexico. He is quite pleased to see Canby replaced by General James Carleton.
Carson had known James Carleton before. He liked him. He developed a relationship with Carleton, not unlike his relationship with Fremont. Carson was surprisingly insecure around these higher-ranking military officers, and especially men of intense temperament and high education. Fremont and Carleton were both that way. He deferred to them.
With the Confederate defeat, Carson submits his resignation. He wants to return to Josefa and his children, but General Carleton refuses to accept the letter. He needs Carson.
Appealing to Kit's strong sense of patriotism, he persuaded him to stay in the service. So Kit led campaigns first against the Mescalero Apaches, a small tribe, and when they were defeated, Carleton then sent him to deal with the much larger problem, that of the Navajos.
No southwestern tribe is more powerful than the Navajos. Numbering at least 10,000, they hold sway over a vast territory centered in the Red Rock deserts of western New Mexico and eastern Arizona.
The Navajos were actually raiders. Anything that emerged from the Mother Earth, it belonged to them if it was in their domain. And that meant taking it. Taking it and defeating people for it. It was their cultural right, and they believed that way. So as a result, Hopis, Pueblo people, Zuni people, Apaches, Utes, they were the enemy of the Navajo. Sworn enemies. And so when Kit Carson starts a campaign against the Navajos, there are many Indian groups who are willing to go to war with him against the Navajos.
In June 1863, Carson marches westward with 700 men, including many Ute warriors, against the Navajos. Penetrating their stronghold at Canyon de Chelly, he pursues a scorched earth policy, destroying their crops and livestock that results in little loss of life, but by midwinter forces the surrender of nearly 9,000 Navajos.
A new America is emerging out of the Civil War. It's America that doesn't recognize loyalty to state or loyalty to tribe. One nation, one people, one flag. Kit Carson doesn't realize what he's the agent of, but he's the agent of that new America, and the Navajos are in the way.
Other tribes surrounding the Navajo, who had been pummeled by the Navajos in raids over the years, also saw the army moving in and took advantage of the opportunity. So the Navajos were attacked on all sides.
General Carleton orders the Navajos marched across New Mexico to the Bosque Redondo at Fort Sumner on the Pecos River. It is a catastrophe. Rations and transportations are limited. The defeated people weak and malnourished. The weather brutal, and the local population they must march through quite hostile. At Bosque Redondo, it is even worse. Starvation and disease take a heavy toll. It will be 4 ghastly years before they will be allowed to return to their homeland by an embarrassed government. For the Navajo people, it is the turning point of their history, and they lay the blame for this disaster on Kit Carson.
Things were changing so fast that the dynamics of the Navajos being the dominant no longer was that anymore. And having to accept that, when you're once the highest or the most strongest individuals, meaning tribe or group of people, and now you're less than that, humiliated by your enemies, that changes you, and you remember that.
There can be 2 versions of the past. They're not necessarily exclusive. To the Navajo people, the story of Canyon de Chelly and the Long Walk and Bosque Redondo is a period of intense pain. Pain for them personally, pain for them as a nation, as a people. And they blame Kit Carson for that, the man who was once their friend, who then came to fight against them.
I think Carson's life can be summed up as he saw it best by quoting something that he said. He said, "I am not sure if I did right or if I did wrong, but I always did what I thought was best."
Carson fights one final great battle against the Kiowas and Comanches on November 26, 1864, at the old Texas trading post of Adobe Walls. His last military assignment is to Fort Garland in southern Colorado. He brings Josefa and their 6 children up from Taos to be with him.
Over 25 years of marriage, Kit and Josefa Carson have been apart more than they've been together because most of the time he is in the service of his country. He's taken a delegation of Ute Indians to Washington, D.C., and on that journey he becomes desperately ill. He goes to every doctor he can find just to get well enough to get home, and he gets as far as Bent's Fort, and it looks like they're going to be reunited at last. Josefa comes to Bent's Fort. She's pregnant. She has a successful birth and delivery, and things look as if they're going to be at least okay. He's very sick, when suddenly she falls ill with childbed fever and dies, and he's devastated by this. He lives only one more month.
Carson dies on May 23, 1868, from the effects of a ruptured aneurysm in his chest. He is taken to Taos, where he can rest beside his wife. Jesse Benton Fremont, who had visited with Carson in Washington and knew he was near death, was nevertheless devastated by the news. The great hunter hero she had helped to create was gone.
Kit Carson was a man among men, a type of the real American pioneer, not only fearless but clear-headed, as gentle as he was strong. All who knew Carson best, when they hear him spoken of, will not think of him only as the brave man or the great hunter or the cool, sagacious, admirable guide, but first and tenderly as their dear old Kit.
In many ways, Kit Carson has destroyed what he loves the most. He sees the passing of the era of the fur trade. He participates in the destruction of the real power of the Indian tribes. And finally, he finds himself in the post-Civil War West, a symbol himself of a bygone era. As he lays dying, the railroad is pushing across the plains. New heroes are going to arise out of this new West. Custer the soldier, but even more importantly, a young buffalo hunter for that very railroad. Someone who's going to take the story of the Wild West, the story of the hunter hero, onto an international stage. A young fellow who comes to be called Buffalo Bill Cody.
You're watching Carson and Cody, the Hunter Heroes, on the History Channel.
Gentlemen, permit me to introduce to you a Congress of the Rough Riders of the World.
No one symbolizes the last great push westward better than Buffalo Bill Cody. He's the plainsman hero, the scout of the prairie, the person who fights in the Indian Wars, rides the Pony Express, hunts for the army and the railroad, and then eventually becomes the great symbol of the West to several generations of Americans and people all around the world.
By the time Bill Cody became Buffalo Bill, the West was a place that was incontestably a part of the United States. And this means that that Wild West was a place in the past rather than in the present for Cody.
Born in Scott County, Iowa on February 26, 1846, William Frederick Cody is the third child of Isaac and Mary Laycock Cody. Isaac Cody moves his family to the newly organized Kansas Territory in 1854, settling near Fort Leavenworth. Political strife consumes Kansas as advocates of slavery and of free soil contend for the control of territorial government. Isaac Cody takes a leading role in this struggle to keep Kansas free of slavery. Dangerously wounded in September 1854, while giving an anti-slavery speech, Cody is thereafter a hunted man as bands of pro-slavery men search for him and terrorize his family. On several occasions, the boy helps his father escape from Missouri border ruffians and pro-slavery neighbors. Young Will Cody views his father as a martyr to the cause of freedom, and this belief helps direct his entire life.
Here was really the beginning of the Kansas Troubles. My father, who had shed the first blood in the cause of the freedom of Kansas, was threatened with death by hanging or shooting if he dared to remain.
Isaac Cody recovers enough to win election to the Free Soil Topeka legislature in 1856. But hounded by his enemies and plagued by his wound, he dies, March 1857.
When Isaac Cody died, he charged his son Will and Will's older sister Julia with taking care of their younger siblings and their ailing mother.
With the family impoverished and his mother increasingly frail, young Will Cody seeks employment with the great Western freighting firm of Majors and Russell. He travels west across the Santa Fe Trail and north to Fort Laramie. He works on the Great Supply Caravans, supporting the troops sent to Utah in the Mormon War of 1857.
A typical day on the trail started very, very early. You had to hitch up the oxen or get the animals ready, and all day long you're worrying about taking care of them. The people cannot survive if the animals don't survive.
While on the trail to Fort Laramie, the boy is befriended by a man who becomes both mentor and protector to him, James Butler Hickok, soon to be known throughout the West as Wild Bill.
He was 10 years my senior, a tall, handsome, magnificently built and powerful young fellow who could outrun, outjump, and outfight any man in the train. Of his bravery, there was not a doubt. Wild Bill was my protector and intimate friend, and the friendship thus began continued until his death.
With sectional tension at a flashpoint over the 1860 presidential election, rapid communication between the East and California becomes vital. The transcontinental telegraph is not yet completed, and so Russell, Majors, and Waddell begin the short-lived Pony Express in April 1860.
They created the Pony Express with hundreds of horses and with relay stations every 10 to 15 miles and riders who would ride 60 miles at a stretch. Billy Cody was one of those riders, and one of the most famous of the station tenders for the Pony Express was Wild Bill Hickok.
The company promises to complete the nearly 2,000-mile trip in 10 days, come hell or high water, and the riders do it. 15-year-old Will Cody is credited with the third longest ride of any of the Pony Riders, 322 miles in 21 hours and 40 minutes, using 21 horses.
Having heard of my mother's poor health, I determined to make her a visit, arriving there in June 1861. The Civil War had broken out and excitement ran high. My mother, of course, was a strong Union woman and had such great confidence in the government that she believed the war would not last over 6 months.
Will Cody, anxious to avenge his father, attempts to enlist, but being too young is stopped by his ailing mother. She extracts a solemn pledge that he will not join the army so long as she lives. When she dies in November 1863, Will is devastated, but also released from his pledge.
One day, after having been under the influence of bad whiskey, I awoke to find myself a soldier in the 7th Kansas Regiment. I did not remember how or when I had enlisted, but I saw I was in for it, and that it would not do for me to endeavor to back out.
Private Cody is soon on his way to Tennessee with his regiment. In the fighting that follows, Cody is often employed as a scout and spy. In September, the 7th Kansas is ordered to Missouri, where Private Cody spends his last months of war on detached duty at Union headquarters in St. Louis. There, he meets Louisa Federici.
Young Will Cody and Louisa Federici had a whirlwind courtship. He was in the biggest town he'd ever been in, St. Louis, Missouri. It is a town that is full of temptations for a guy like him, but he's trying to be a manly young man. They had a flirtation. They exchanged letters. It's not clear exactly who raised the idea of marriage or not, and it's one of the great mysteries of American courtship, why this ever happened, because it began to go wrong so quickly that it's hard to imagine what he ever saw in her.
A convent-educated city girl who was 3 years older than Will Cody and never quite reconciled to the kind of life that he wanted to lead and that he had to lead. But nonetheless, she married him. She went west with him. She, in the end, bore him 4 children, and in the end, she outlived all of her children and her husband, a tragic figure.
The newlyweds try their hand at hotel keeping in the Salt Creek Valley, but the occupation proves far too tame for Cody, especially with the territory booming as a new railroad pushes across Kansas.
I sold out the Golden Rule House and started alone for Saline, Kansas, which was then the end of the track for the Kansas Pacific Railway. I met again my old friend Wild Bill, who was scouting for the government. He told me that they needed more scouts, and I accordingly accompanied him to the fort.
Throughout the winter of 1866-1867, Cody scouts out of several Kansas Army posts, most notably Fort Hays. There, he meets an ailing Kit Carson.
At this time, his health was failing. It was my privilege to enjoy a personal acquaintance with Carson, but this intimacy gave me little advantage, for he seldom spoke of his own deeds, though I hardly think he was so different from other men as to be wholly indifferent to praise.
In the spring of 1867, another distinguished visitor to Fort Hays shares none of Kit Carson's modesty. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the dashing boy general of the Civil War, is barely 6 years older than Cody. He has been placed in command of the newly created 7th Cavalry, with orders to keep the peace on the volatile Indian frontier. Cody guides him the 65 miles to Fort Larned. Custer asks him to scout for the 7th, and Cody is tempted, but soon receives another offer.
When he was offered a job by one of the Kansas Pacific Railroad contractors, the Goddard brothers, to supply buffalo meat to the railroad workers, he jumped at it. And he was so good at it that they paid him $500 a month and supplied him with a butcher to do all the really dirty work.
Between October 1867 and May 1868, Cody, mounted on his fleet horse Brigham and armed with a breech-loading .50 caliber Springfield rifle dubbed Lucretia Borgia, kills 4,280 buffalo to feed the workers of the Kansas Pacific. He becomes a familiar sight in the tough end of tract towns, where the workers nickname him Buffalo Bill. The name sticks.
Cody earned his keep with the railroad, killing buffalo to feed the railroad workers. It was a job. Some people said somebody had to do it. Others said maybe they didn't have to be quite as efficient at it as they were.
In fact, he was so successful at it that the railroad workers, tired of buffalo meat, made up a jingle about it. They said, Buffalo Bill always aims and shoots to kill, never missed and never will, and the company pays his Buffalo Bill.
But Cody's profitable job ends in May 1868, when the Kansas Pacific temporarily halts construction. To the west of End of Track, the Plain tribes, Cheyennes, Arapahoes, Kiowas, and Comanches, paint themselves for war. They will fight to protect their buffalo range. In this war, young Bill Cody will become a legend as Buffalo Bill, Chief of Scouts. Throughout the fall and winter of 1867, the Kansas Pacific Railroad builds relentlessly across the heart of the Great Buffalo Range, splitting the herd in two. The animals number in the millions, and everyone believes that the supply of buffalo is inexhaustible.
In the middle of the 19th century, there were 30 million, maybe as many as 50 million. Nobody is quite sure how many bison roamed the plains. They were the commissary of the American Indians on the plains, and they became the commissary of the plainsmen.
You know, Indian people learned that they could use the buffalo 52 different ways. Food, shelter, weapons. It was much more than just food. A part of their religion, philosophy, their whole scheme of life, their whole ethos. So when they saw professional hunters like Buffalo Bill Cody and seeing the numbers of buffalo being slaughtered, it really, I think, hurt them inside, because as the Cheyenne people say, that they are the buffalo. And when the buffalo are gone, they are gone.
Cody was incredibly successful as a hunter for the railroad. Not only did he make a lot of money, of course, he earned his nickname, Buffalo Bill. But Indian raids finally stopped the progress of the Kansas Pacific, and Cody was out of a job, but not for long. He found new employment in the Indian War that was going to be waged by the United States government to protect the interest of the railroad and advance settlement throughout Kansas.
The government has decided to concentrate all the Southern Plain tribes on reservations in the Indian Territory. Some bands agree to go, and new treaties are signed, but most refuse to give up the old ways. To change their minds, the Army sends out its top combat officer, a tough bantam-sized general soon infamous for making the statement that the only good Indian is a dead Indian.
General Philip Henry Sheridan was a great cavalry hero of the Civil War. Now he'd been sent west to fight Indians. He was looking for good men, good scouts, and he found his favorite scout in Buffalo Bill.
In those days, the railroad town of Hays City was filled with so-called Indian scouts whose common boast was of having slain scores of redskins. But the real scout, that is, a guide and trailer knowing the habits of the Indians, was very scarce. Cody was first brought to my notice by distinguishing himself in bringing me an important dispatch from Fort Larned to Fort Hays, a distance of 65 miles, through a section infested with Indians.
Cody's message informs Sheridan that hundreds of Kiowas and Comanches have joined the warring bands to the southwest. Sheridan must alter his troop dispositions, but can find no messengers willing to carry his dispatches the 95 miles to Fort Dodge.
Cody, learning of the strait I was in, manfully came to the rescue and proposed to make the trip to Dodge. In all, Cody rode about 350 miles in less than 60 hours, and such an exhibition of endurance and courage convinced me that his services would be extremely valuable in the campaign.
Cody's amazing ride and vital information he carries allows Sheridan to shift his troops for a winter campaign offensive. Sheridan appoints Cody as Chief of Scouts with the 5th Cavalry. From September 1868 until November 1872, they fight in 9 engagements. Sheridan's quartermaster, Colonel Henry Inman, recognizes that Cody has emerged above all other frontier scouts.
The mantle of Kit Carson fits more perfectly the shoulders of Cody than those of any other of the great frontiersman's successors.
Sheridan's campaign forces most of the Southern Plains tribes onto their designated reservations in the Indian Territory. But Tall Bull's dog soldiers, the most warlike of the Cheyennes, ride north to join the Sioux. Sheridan transfers the 5th Cavalry to Fort McPherson on Nebraska's Platte River to meet this threat.
In the summer of 1869, in one of the classic cavalry charges of the Indian Wars, General Eugene Carr and the 5th Cavalry and a battalion of Pawnee Scouts wiped out the village of the Cheyenne dog soldiers' leader Tall Bull in northeastern Colorado. And Buffalo Bill had guided the 5th Cavalry to a point where it could make its charge virtually undetected.
We went through their village, shooting right and left at everything we saw. The Pawnees, the regular soldiers, and the officers were all mixed up together. General Carr had instructed the command to keep a sharp lookout for white women, as he was confident that the Indians had some captives. We soon found 2 white women, one of whom had just been wounded.
During the battle, Cody slays Tall Bull. With the chief's death and the destruction of the dog soldier encampment, the power of the Cheyenne war faction is broken. The railroad lines and white settlements are now secure. Change now comes to the west with the speed of the iron horse. For Cody, that change comes in the form of a dumpy little man with a zest for life and a talent for writing wonderful trash.
So you're Buffalo Bill, huh?
Yes, sir.
You're not exactly what I expected.
Not long after the Battle of Summit Springs, a portly Eastern lecturer and writer named Edward Zane Carroll Judson finds Cody and starts asking him questions, not about the campaign, but about Cody's friend, Wild Bill Hickok. Cody said this little dumpy man was full of questions. And Judson, better known as Ned Buntline, then bound all these stories up into a tale that he called King of the Bordermen.
On December 23, 1869, the New York Weekly publishes the first installment of Buntline's serial story, Buffalo Bill, the King of the Bordermen, advertising it as the wildest, truest story he ever wrote. Despite the fact that it has absolutely nothing to do with the real Buffalo Bill, the title of the tale catches on. The wonderful alliteration of that name, Buffalo Bill, begins to work its magic.
In 1871, Sheridan sponsored a big buffalo hunt on the plains for a gaggle of Eastern millionaires that included Lawrence Jerome, the grandfather of Winston Churchill, and James Gordon Bennett, the influential publisher of the New York Herald. And so he got Buffalo Bill to be their scout to make sure they bagged a buffalo or two and managed to uncork all their champagne without injury.
Covering almost 200 miles in 10 days, the hunters leave a trail of empty champagne bottles and dead animal carcasses from Fort McPherson to Fort Hayes. The millionaire's hunt proves to be but a practice run for a more important 1872 hunt staged for the Grand Duke Alexis, third son of the Russian Tsar, who also wants a taste of Western adventure. Sheridan orders Cody to remain at Fort McPherson so he can organize the royal hunt. Cody's first job is to convince Chief Spotted Tail to bring 100 Sioux south to entertain the Grand Duke. When the royal party arrives at the hunting camp on January 13, 1872, everything is ready.
General Sheridan was well pleased with the arrangements and delighted to find that Spotted Tail and his Indians had arrived on time. General Custer, who was one of the hunting party, carried on a mild flirtation with Spotted Tail's daughter, and it was noticed that the Duke Alexis paid considerable attention to another handsome redskin maiden. Of course, the main thing was to give Alexis the first chance and the best shot at the buffaloes.
The hunt is a grand success. The Sioux women of Spotted Tail's camp make good use of the fallen beasts, and every night is marked with a great feast. The Grand Duke gives Cody several valuable gifts to mark the end of the hunt, but General Sheridan gives his young scouts some advice that proves far more valuable.
General Sheridan took occasion to remind me of an invitation to visit New York, which I had received from some of the gentlemen who accompanied the general on the hunt from Fort McPherson. Obtaining 30 days' leave of absence from the department, I struck out for the east.
Cody soon boards a train for New York. There, he is wined and dined by all of New York society, anxious to see this new lion of the West. Cody finally escapes from his hosts, anxious to seek out an old acquaintance not numbered among the city's elite, Ned Buntline.
When Cody found himself lost amidst the canyons of New York in 1872, Ned Buntline found him and took him in tow again. Buntline took him to see a play that had been adapted from his own dreadful story, King of the Bordermen, a play with a fictional Buffalo Bill portrayed by an actor named J.B. Studley. And there, Buntline, knowing history and knowing destiny, apparently, introduced the real Buffalo Bill to the assembled audience. Of course, they went wild. Cody was forced onto the stage to try to say a few words for himself, mumbled something, and then ran as fast as he could back west.
On returning to Fort McPherson, Cody is soon scouting against raiding Sioux. His remarkable heroics in a running fight with the Indians on Nebraska's Loup River wins him the Medal of Honor. But by then, his eyes are turned eastward, where Ned Buntline is offering fame and fortune, if only Buffalo Bill will return to play himself on eastern stages. The frontier's greatest scout is about to become the world's greatest showman. Buffalo Bill departs Fort McPherson and his life as a scout, headed for Chicago and a new career before the theatrical footlights in December 1872. He recruits John Texas Jack Omohundro to accompany him. Jack is a former rebel cavalryman who had driven Texas cattle north to Kansas before signing on as an Army scout with Cody. Ned Buntline meets them in Chicago and informs them that they open at Nixon's Amphitheater in 5 days.
The Scouts of the Prairie was an Indian drama, and there were 50 supers dressed as Indians. In the fight with them, Jack and I were at home. We would kill them all off in one act, but they would come up again ready for business in the next.
The play is a huge success, playing nightly to packed houses. The theater critic for the Chicago Times reports that Buntline claimed to have written the play in just 4 hours, and that everyone wonders why it took him so long. The novelty of seeing the actual frontier heroes playing themselves on stage simply mesmerizes audiences.
He's got this aura around him. He definitely had a charisma like no other person in his time. And he was able to then communicate what the West was all about through this personal charisma. He wasn't much of an actor, but people just packed into his performances anyway.
The Western is born thanks to Ned Buntline and Buffalo Bill, and popular entertainment is never to be the same again. The play tours St. Louis, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Rochester, Boston, and New York, greeted everywhere by enthusiastic audiences, stunned theater critics, and overflowing box office tills. By the time they play New York in June, they are national sensations, even if the critic for the New York Herald is unimpressed.
Buffalo Bill is a good-looking fellow, tall and straight as an arrow, but ridiculous as an actor. Texas Jack is not quite so good-looking, not so tall, not so straight, and not so ridiculous. Everything is so wonderfully bad, it is almost good.
He was the prettiest thing anybody had ever seen, young Buffalo Bill. A strapping young man, broad-shouldered, narrowing all the way down, handsome face, broad brow, just the kind of figure of American manhood that was hard to even contain in a building.
By the time the tour ends, Cody is fully committed to the stage. He and Buntline soon part company. The aging hack rider, having created his greatest character, fades into obscurity. For the 1873 season, Cody enlists his old friend Wild Bill Hickok, now even more famous as the two-gun lawman of Hays City and Abilene, to tour with he and Texas Jack in Scouts of the Plains.
Hickok was not what you'd call a tame actor. He liked mixing it up off stage with the thugs that used to hang around the theaters. And it would have been all right, but on stage he liked playing practical jokes on the supers. And so those who were lying around dead, for example, on stage, he'd fire blanks next to their legs, make them jump, make them howl.
Cody's efforts to imbue his friend with a proper respect for show business all fail. After a particularly heated exchange, Hickok storms out mid-show, heading west once more for his 1876 rendezvous with an assassin's bullet in a Black Hills boomtown called Deadwood. By 1876, Cody is wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. He settles his growing family in Rochester, New York, to be nearer the center of the theatrical world. He and Louisa now have two daughters, Arta and Ora, and a son, Kit Carson Cody. Little Kit is but 6 when in April 1876, he is stricken with scarlet fever. His father receives the news just before the curtain goes up in Springfield, Massachusetts. He catches the first train for Rochester.
I found my little boy unable to speak, but he seemed to recognize me. And putting his little arms around my neck, he tried to kiss me. We did everything in our power to save him, but it was of no avail. The Lord claimed his own, and that evening at 6 o'clock, my beloved little Kit died in my arms.
(1876) saw the outbreak of the Great Sioux War, a war that everyone thought was going to be the last of the Indian Wars. Sheridan wanted Cody to come west and take part. It was their last chance to relive the old days.
Cody is only too glad to rejoin the Army, hoping that active military service will distract him from his grief. Reaching Fort Laramie on June 10, 1876, he is immediately reappointed Chief of Scouts by Lieutenant Colonel Eugene Carr. Cody rides into the 5th Cavalry Camp to the cheers of officers and soldiers alike.
All the old boys in the regiment, upon seeing General Carr and Cody together, expressed themselves to the effect that with such a leader and scout, they could get away with all the Sitting Bulls and Crazy Horses in the Sioux tribe.
Sheridan arrives at Fort Laramie on June 15th and enlists Cody to ride with him to inspect the nearby Indian agencies. The Indian agents assure the general that very few warriors have left to join Sitting Bull's hostiles to the north. With Custer's 7th Cavalry scouting the Yellowstone River with its tributaries the Bighorn and Little Bighorn, Sheridan feels confident of victory. But the Indian agents have lied to him. Thousands of warriors have left the agencies to join Sitting Bull on the Little Bighorn. Custer finds them on June 25, 1876, perishing along with every man of 5 companies of the 7th.
Within days of learning of Custer's death and the wiping out of the 7th Cavalry, Cody and the 5th Cavalry hear that as many as 800 Cheyenne warriors have left the Red Cloud Agency near Fort Robinson and are heading rapidly up to the Little Bighorn. In a forced march of 85 miles in 36 hours, the 5th, guided by Cody, finds itself finally lying across the path of those Cheyennes at a place called Warbonnet Creek in extreme northwestern Nebraska.
At dawn on July 17, 1876, the Cheyennes, several hundred strong, approach Warbonnet Creek. Their leader is called Yellow Hair. A party of Cheyenne warriors break away from the main group to pursue 2 5th Cavalry couriers on the prairie. Cody asks permission to cut off the warriors.
We instantly dashed over the bluffs and advanced on a gallop towards the Indians. One of the Indians, who was handsomely decorated, sang out to me in his own tongue, "I know you, Pahe Haska. If you want to fight, come ahead and fight me." I concluded to accept the challenge.
Cody and Yellowhair see each other. They fire. Cody's shot goes through Yellowhair's leg, brings down his pony. Almost at the same instant, Cody's horse goes down after stepping in a hole. He rolls on the ground, comes up, takes quick and careful aim, and dispatches Yellowhair. He races over to the body and scalps Yellowhair, holds the scalp and the war bonnet up, and shouts, "The first scalp for Custer."
That day is one of the most remarkable in all of Western history. Cody rides forth dressed in a stage costume, a Mexican vaquero outfit, to complete a ritualistic act of violence on a grand Western stage that is as old as Plymouth Rock and Jamestown. Was it art imitating life, life imitating art? I mean, what is real and what is myth? Is the perfect moment of the blending of Western myth and Western reality. But it's ever so real, and the stakes are life and death.
The 5th pursues the Cheyennes back to the Red Cloud Agency. After all is secure, Cody writes to Louisa,
"We have had a fight. I killed a Cheyenne chief in a single-handed fight. You will no doubt hear of it through the papers."
All of America soon reads about it in the papers. A nation stunned by Custer's defeat embraces Cody's heroics. Warbonnet Creek is the one bright spot in a summer marked by disaster, as columns under Generals Terry and Crook failed to snare Sitting Bull.
The Indian campaign went nowhere. Terry and Crook, in fact, seemed to be doing everything they could to avoid finding the Indians. The Shoshone scouts were disgusted. They all went home. Buffalo Bill was disgusted, too, and he headed east for his most successful season ever, with a new play based on Warbonnet Creek, the Red Right Hand, or their first scalp for Custer.
In 1883, Cody plans a magnificent Western pageant, combining rodeo features like bucking broncos, roping and riding, with historical dramas such as an attack on a settler's cabin, Custer's Last Stand, and the duel at Warbonnet Creek. He decides to title it simply The Wild West. The theater stage proves too small to contain the epic story Bill Cody wants to tell. He partners with Nate Salisbury, an old show business pro with keen organizing talent. Buffalo Bill's Wild West, America's national entertainment, opens in St. Louis in the spring of 1884. Although the enterprise will lose $60,000 its first year, it will soon be grossing millions, making Cody one of the wealthiest men in America. Contributing mightily to the financial success of the show is a young woman from Ohio with uncanny skill with a rifle.
Buffalo Bill calls her Missy, and Annie Oakley became, after Cody himself, for the next 17 years, the big star of the Wild West show.
Like Buffalo Bill, Cody, Annie Oakley reinvents herself. She goes from a childhood that anyone would consider to be a nightmare to becoming one of the most famous women in the world, having an audience with Queen Victoria, being invited to dine with the most famous people of her time. She is a creature of her own creation.
When somebody came along like Annie Oakley, who could shoot better than he could, he was more than happy to step back and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am the ringmaster, and I would like to present to you my superior, this young woman who can outshoot all the rest of us." And this was the great showmanship. He knew how to get out of the spotlight at the right time.
Cody's Wild West was a remarkable combination of historical pageant, living tableaus, and the rodeo. And in this grand extravaganza, he managed to create a new American character, the cowboy. Previously, the cowboy had been a negative figure. That cowboy element, those cowboys, it was a slur. But Cody makes the cowboy the essence of Americanism. Soon, the cowboy is celebrated throughout the world as the very symbol of America.
In 1885, another new star headlines with the Wild West, one who, like Buffalo Bill, carries with him the authentic history of the West, the Sioux chief, Sitting Bull.
Cody persuaded him to join the Wild West for a season. He was presented in all his dignity. Cody had a great deal of admiration for Sitting Bull and simply allowed him to ride out into the arena and be introduced as the great statesman of the Sioux.
He is a person who is a statesman, an orator, a native intellectual, not just a great chief, but a leader who is wise, a person who saw things in a much larger scheme of life. Some might even call him a genius.
Cody employs hundreds of Indians in his show. He treats them with respect and demands that others do so as well.
Indeed, it is about imagery, about showmanship, and all of that. But if it were not for that, then they would be frozen in time, an enemy defeated who would never rise again or even be acknowledged. Why do we know about Indians today? In such a limited way. It would be even less than that if it were not for Buffalo Bill. He carried the West into the 20th century, and with that, he carried American Indians.
In 1887, the Wild West travels to Europe as part of the American exhibition honoring Queen Victoria on her Golden Jubilee. A private performance is arranged for the Queen at Earl's Court in London.
And an abbreviated version of the grand entry swept into the arena with the Indians whooping and the cowboys shooting and the cavalry carrying the colors. And then the color bearer and Cody himself came up before the royal box and the colors were dipped. Cody bowed and Victoria stood up, and for the first time in British and American history, a British monarch saluted the American flag.
When Buffalo Bill goes to the glittering capitals of Europe, he becomes the embodiment of a triumphant America that he presents in the Wild West show as a kind of unrolling of American history, the triumph of strong, true, brave, free people, people in motion, people in action, and he himself is an embodiment of this great American spirit and American character.
While Cody's Wild West triumphantly tours the capitals of Europe, trouble brews in the West. The Sioux and other Western tribes follow the siren call of Indian resistance and renewal and practice the new ghost dance.
In November 1890, Cody receives an urgent telegram from General Miles. Sitting Bull is being blamed for the revival of the ghost dance among the Sioux, and the agent, Major James McLaughlin, is concerned that Sitting Bull may be instigating trouble. Miles wants to bring Sitting Bull in to talk.
General Nelson Miles sends Cody to bring in Sitting Bull, but the minions of the corrupt Indian Bureau convinced President Benjamin Harrison to recall the old scout at the last minute. Indian Bureau police go out and arrest Sitting Bull, and the chief is killed in the attempt. The ghastly Wounded Knee massacre soon follows. Cody is devastated.
They were the inheritors of the land that we live on. They owned it when the white man came, and the white man took it away from them. It was natural that they should resist. They are like every other class of people. They like to defend their rights. I believe the Indians are more sinned against than sinning.
When Buffalo Bill's Wild West begins the 1898 season at New York's Madison Square Garden, it features a dozen battle-scarred veterans of the Cuban Revolution against Spain. Headlines in the New York World declared that with 30,000 Indian braves, Cody could liberate Cuba. When war is declared on April 25th, the nation is anxious for Buffalo Bill to take a leading role.
The outbreak of the Spanish-American War gave Cody one more chance to be a hero. He wanted to go. General Nelson Miles wanted him to come for the invasion of Puerto Rico. But this time it wasn't going to happen. There were too many people dependent upon Cody for a livelihood. He had too many responsibilities. He was too old. He was going to miss this war.
For 30 years, Cody's Wild West formulates the cliches and conventions later continued in Western films and television. Along with nearly 2,000 dime novels in various languages around the world, Cody is cemented as the greatest of the frontier hunter heroes. In this time, he makes and loses several fortunes before the show finally fails in 1913. He tours with other shows for 3 more years, but by then is only a sad caricature of his former self. By 1916, he is so ill and worn out that he can no longer ride. When he dies in Denver on January 10th, 1917, former President Theodore Roosevelt gives tribute to the hunter hero.
Buffalo Bill was an American of Americans, and his memory shall be dear to all Americans, for he embodied those traits of courage, strength, and self-reliant hardihood which are vital to the well-being of our nation.
It matters not, so I've been told, where the body lies when the heart grows cold. But grant, oh grant, one wish to me, please bury me now on the lone prairie.
By the time Buffalo Bill dies, the West is a place that's fully gridded, it's settled, it's inhabited, it's farmed, it's plowed, it's planted, it's traversed by railroads. It isn't the same wild or unknown or unknowable place that it had been when he first came out there. And for many people, that was a great tragedy.
The time of the hunter hero had ended. A new era and a new America, built on their toil and their sacrifice, has come to be. They have given the nation a new beginning, a continental destiny, but in doing so have killed what they love most. They are already the stuff of dreams. Theodore Roosevelt, himself a mighty hunter, but with his eye keenly on a steel and steam future, views them with warm nostalgia.
They were the heralds of the oncoming civilization, the pioneers in that conquest of the wilderness which has at last been achieved in our own day. The frontier had come to an end. With it vanished also the old race of wilderness hunters.
With the passing of Buffalo Bill, the last connection with the Old West was gone as well. He may have been a symbol of progress, but he was also a symbol of nostalgia, of a bygone era, of the beginnings of a nation. And in his life, and in the lives of all the hunter heroes, there were the elements that told the story of a new people and the rise of America. And when Buffalo Bill dies, that old America, that pioneer America, dies with him.
The History Channel proudly offers the program you're watching on home video for only $29.95 plus shipping and handling. To order, call 1-800-708-1776 or shop online at History Channel.